Okay, I'm here with the legend, the man, the founding father of functional medicine, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, one of the most influential people in my life. And the work he's done has really impacted everything we do at the Crosby Institute and all the patients we impact through that model. So thank you, Dr. Bland, for being with us.
Well, thank you. I'd like to do a shout out to you because I remember so clearly the first time that I had the opportunity to meet you personally. Your reputation was already quite wide, and people were talking about you. This would be probably, oh gee, maybe between 15 and 20 years ago. I don't know the exact date, but it was more than a decade ago. And your reputation as a leader in education and bringing clinical news to use was really very, very strong. But I hadn't met you personally, and then I was on a plane heading to a meeting, and so were you. And we just by happen chance happened to meet, and I immediately could see just by how you approach your life, how you communicate, your enthusiasm, and your willingness to dig deep and to connect with people in a very meaningful way, why you were such an effective both clinician and educator. So you made an immediate, very positive impact on me that has stayed with me and grown over the decades now. So I want to thank you as taking the baton and just running with it and doing such a great job.
Thank you so much. I remember that day. I remember getting off the phone and calling my wife, going, "Guess who was like literally sitting next to me on the plane?"
It was one of those great
Like, wow, the universe did us
serendipity.
connect that day. But I want to, for me, I got exposed to your work when I was in my early 20s. I was just in my first year of chiropractic school, and someone goes, "If you want to learn nutrition, you need to learn what Jeff Bland is doing." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. How do I learn?" And then you had these books at the time. I think it was through HealthCom. I can't remember. It was,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
we used to put these annual books together every year with updated research. And at that time, the Metagenics rep would come to the school all the time. And we had a stack of these in the library. And I remember reading the first one. I think it was on inflammation and inflammatory pathways. And I remember, like, I didn't understand any of it. So I had to go through and word by word, look up the words, and understand the concepts. And I had my own binder that I would then put together, trying to translate what you put, because I didn't understand the mechanisms. And I remember early on, if I didn't have that influence, I wouldn't understand how important classes I was taking were. So my classmates were just like, "Hey, you got to get through. This is not real life. This is just for the boards." And then after I got exposed to your manual and information, I'm like, okay, everything about biochemistry, physiology, basic sciences is absolutely critical for this model. So I really need to own my skills now. And if I didn't have that early exposure, I don't know what I would be doing. And I think those books you read were so well written, so eloquent, that it really helped me. And then what I remember doing is when I got a stack of them, we had a stack in the library because we already produced so many of them. I went in a timeline from the first one up to the most recent, trying to just understand how you were thinking. My goal wasn't to get the information. I want to know how you were thinking. And then, now we call it a systems biology approach, or really trying to restore function. And at that time, that's not, as a 20-year-old young student, you're thinking, oh, you come up with a diagnosis and then you have treatment. And that wasn't the model. And that was so much of a shock that made so much sense that you would do it in the way you're presenting this model. So I think that was really what triggered with me. And then you don't know this, but I tried to work with Metagenics years ago, and I was working with Rep Biotics, and I go, I got to work with Jeff Bland. I got to work with him. And I actually approached him and I said, you're not qualified. You're not at our level. And we never got to work together.
Well,
So
that was their mistake, I'll tell you.
that was where, and then we got to meet years later, and everything. But it's such a pleasure. So the question I had, and I think everyone has, is where did the term functional medicine come from? Why did you use those words? And do you wish you had changed the name? Is the name just what it's meant to do? What was your thought process behind that initial concept?
Yeah, thank you. I'll try to summarize what was kind of maybe a not straight line path, but I'll try to summarize it. So I think I was born out of an interesting incubator in this field. I came up through a traditional kind of a medical school biochemistry educational background. My goal was to become a research academic at a university. This was the late 60s. I got my PhD in 70. And it was a really kind of a tough time for academics back then because of the nature of the Vietnam War and what was going on to take a lot of, there was just a lot of stuff going on. And people would try to get academic jobs, and there'd be like 400 applicants for one job. And so I wondered if this was really a smart career decision. By that time I had a young family, whether it was a wise career decision. And fortunately, after going through a number of interviews, I did get 3 job offers, and I ended up, because of the nature of one of the offers, I thought it would really give me more ability to grow up my kind of professional perspective. And that was at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, because they offered a position that was both in chemistry and environmental science. They wanted to start an environmental science program because it was the first year of Earth Year. And they wanted, a lot of colleges were starting environmental science programs. And so that university was going to have it in the chemistry department, and they wanted someone that could joint teach in both areas. And I had always had a very deep respect and reverence for environment and environmental science. I thought, well, this would be a great place at a small liberal arts college to really kind of develop my own footprint. And so I took that job, which turned out to be a really great job. And my first research student was a guy by the name of Bruce Chasen, who came in. I still remember it so clearly. And he was a master's degree student in chemistry and environmental science. He said, so Jeff, you know, I'd like to do work on vitamin E. And I knew nothing about vitamin E other than I knew that it was being touted as an anti-aging vitamin and so forth and so on, but I really didn't know much about it. I was not at all really at that point focused on nutrition or nutritional agents. And but he was a very persuasive guy, very young and aggressive guy, and I thought, well, okay, let's give it a whirl. So we put together a series of studies trying to look at the mechanism of aging and cellular aging of vitamin E using human erythrocytes, red blood cells, because they're denucleated cells, and I felt that we could then isolate some of the aspects of vitamin E's effect on membrane lipids and oxidation. This was well before the concept of antioxidants were well described and so forth. And it turned out that we hit some pay dirt. We made some discoveries that were really quite interesting about the mechanism of vitamin E. We did human clinical trials, and we built up a research group. I had about 15 students working for me over the next years, and we published a number of papers. And then that got me to get some visibility with the medical world. Now here's where the story I think is interesting, because this is the incubator. The traditional medical doctor world was disinterested almost entirely in anything we were doing. There was a fringe group of MDs at that point maybe that would be interested in nutritional agents that were coming up through Dr. Linus Pauling's work on orthomolecular medicine and how that combined with Dr. Roger Williams' concept of biochemical individuality. And I had fortunately taken a course with Dr. Pauling in my graduate studies, and so I had some familiarity with him. And so I then thought to myself, if I'm going to take this work that we're doing, this mechanistic work on how vitamin E works in cells, where would be a best place to take it? And at that point I got an invitation from the Northwest Academy of Preventive Medicine in Seattle, where Dr. Pauling was going to be the lead keynote speaker. And so I put together my vitamin E work, and fortunately then he was to do his keynote speech right after I was doing my little, junior professor presentation on vitamin E. And I was very fortunate because he really was struck by what I was talking about. He came up to me afterward, and he said, so Dr. Bland, that's very interesting work, and have you ever considered maybe coming to work with us at the Linus Pauling Institute down in Palo Alto? And because this work really fits in with some of the work we're doing on vitamin C. And I was very flattered, and I said, well, I'm still kind of young in my tenure here, and I'm getting my feet under me as a junior untenured professor. How about, in a couple of years, we keep in communication, and then maybe by that time I'll be ready for a sabbatical, and I'll have gone through the tenure process, and if you're still interested, I could come. Well, that turned out to be a very wise decision for me because that gave me a couple of years then to become much more familiar with what was going on at the institutes. Actually, I invited him to speak at the University of Washington at a big meeting. We had a couple thousand people show up, and he also spoke at the University of Puget Sound. Had, I think, 5,000 people show up for that meeting. So we started to develop a relationship, and I started to understand more the history of what his work really was, going way, way back to the start of his structure function work with atomic and molecular structures, and all through the history of the development of the understanding of the system, the immune system, and antibodies, which was some of his early work, anesthetic drugs. I mean, all sorts of things that his work had really touched upon. So then I started to get invitations to speak on this vitamin E work, principally with what I would call the complementary and alternative medical field. And quite honestly, the group that was probably most interested were the leaders in the Academy of Nutrition of the American Chiropractic Association. So chiropractic really had an affinity for this, and really were interested, some of the leaders in the field, and asked me if I would speak at some of their meetings. Well, that introduced me to the field that I had been totally unfamiliar with, what was going on in the leadership in chiropractic, and that introduced me to naturopathic medicine, some of these other fields. And that then got me to see how these things were all interconnected, how what had been going on in these different disciplines, osteopathic medicine, chiropractic medicine, naturopathic medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, how they started to connect together. And I was always reflecting on what I had been learning from Pauling about cellular systems and the biology of systems, and how that fit together in this concept of structure and function. Because that was really, if I was to characterize Linus Pauling's work and how he won his 2 Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and one in peace, they were all around structure and function at many levels. Molecular structure all the way up through social structure and political structure. And so I started thinking in terms of structure function. That then led, and now this long-winded story finally hopefully brings it to close for you, to the late 80s. And by that time I had actually done my sabbatical, a couple of years with Pauling's Institute, had so been impacted by that I had decided to give up my tenure as a professor, which was, when I think back, kind of crazy, because I had a family and I had all sorts of responsibilities we all have. But I decided one day after being at the Pauling Institute that I needed to form an institute or an activity that would help to educate practitioners how to implement personalized nutrition in their practice. That was my business model. So I gave up my tenured professorship, my research group, started this little company called HealthCom. This was 1983. And started to work on how we could educate practitioners across disciplines. Because by that time I was very convinced that we were going to be seeing over time many different healthcare disciplines converging on this concept of structure and function. So that then led to 1988. My wife Susan said, Jeff, by that time I'd been traveling quite a bit, lecturing actually around the world. And Susan said, you've got all these people you speak about that you have great admiration and respect for, and you travel to their places. Why don't we form some kind of a conclave here? Let's invite some of your top leaders that you really respect to come here for 3 days. We'll pay their way and have a whiteboard discussion about what would be the best healthcare system we could think of if we took away reimbursement and licensure, and we just talked about what would it look like. Well, that turned out to be an amazing event for me and I think for those who attended. It was about 35 people that came to Victoria, Vancouver Island, British Columbia. Susan had selected a really nice place for us to have this meeting. And the meeting was so productive because it was people from all different disciplines and backgrounds bringing their own thoughts, and we all kind of had meeting of the minds. And at the end, we said we ought to do this one more time. That what we had been talking about all these days was function, and so I thought, well, geez, could function be really a uniting term for us across all these disciplines? Because every discipline seemed to be interested and involved with trying to improve function, either metabolic function, physical function, cognitive function, behavioral function. And so maybe function was a uniting term to get away from holistic or alternative or complementary or molecular, because maybe it connected to the emerging science of systems thinking. And I came back the next morning to the group and I said, what do you think if we were to call ourselves functional medicine? And they said, oh, Jeff, that's not a good word really, because it's kind of pejorative. The way it's used in medicine is either psychosomatic medicine, functional, I mean it's all in your mind, or geriatric medicine, rehabilitative medicine, which is at the end of life type of things. It doesn't really have much modern connotation. And I said, well, I understand that historically, but actually, if you follow the medical literature, now we're starting to see articles on functional cardiology, functional neurology, functional radiology. So maybe it's redefining what it means, and maybe we should skate to where the puck is going. And so we had a big discussion about that, and we finally agreed, okay, let's call this the Institute for Functional Medicine and see if it has any stickiness, see if anybody else would be interested in affiliating with that. And that was people like David Jones and Graham Reedy and Joe Pizzorno, the kind of the leadership starting group. We had people from Australia, people from England, people from Taiwan in that group. And so we kind of formed around this concept of function as being a way of assessing a trajectory towards health or disease. It was an earlier approach towards upstream causation of downstream pathology that we would later put a label on and call a disease. And that was really 1989, 1990. And so in 1990, then we formed the Institute for Functional Medicine, and then in 1991 we had our first international conference, which was in Wailea on the island of Maui in Hawaii, and where we had people come from, I think it was 16 countries, to kind of really charter functional medicine. That was the formal start, really, in 1991.
And at this time, I remember we had dinner once, and you told me a story of these two young men came knocking at your door at the university. One was Dr. John Bastyr and Joseph Pizzorno, and they're like, hey, we need some help. We need a university professor to help us start an naturopathic school. And that I can see the story that you told me then to now, where you were seeing these commonalities between chiropractic and naturopathic and Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, but they didn't have the science background, didn't have the biochemistry. They were kind of just going to a diagnosis and to a protocol of what they need to do. And it's like you're coming in with this perspective of, hey, this is the neurobiology or the physiology of these mechanisms, and this is how you guys all interrelate. And actually what you're doing is really all similar. And it seemed to be this connection that you made that made a huge difference, and then that changed the assessment, because the assessment wasn't so much the diagnosis, but what systems were functioning and not functioning, right? Is the immune system functioning? Is the blood sugar system functioning? Is the endocrine system functioning? It wasn't so much about the end stage diagnosis or name. And then that kind of made every specialty kind of, let's say, be less efficient, because you really had to cross all different specialties to really get someone to restore health. And that was to this day, it's such a mind-blowing concept. And it's almost like you have to know everything and then try to figure out this web of what's wrong, and then try to pick a priority clinically of what will have impact on this web more than any other mechanism you can implement. Maybe it's diet, maybe it's nutraceutical, maybe it's lifestyle, maybe it's a combination of both, but you're trying to impact all the different parts of this web. And I remember I heard you speak, I think for the first time it was at the Vancouver. So I read all the stuff I could find that you've written, but then I finally got a chance to see you speak. And you did use the word web, and I to this day I use that word web, and I think about everything in a web. And I kind of, when I evaluate a chronic patient, I think of the web, and I put that web out in my head. I even sometimes draw it out on a piece of paper, and I go, where do I need to pull? And that, I think, is the most important thing that I've learned. Just the principle of function is, and now looking at the spectrum of functional medicine practitioners, we see all different types. We see some that are really, really advanced. We see some that are struggling. We see some that really don't understand functional medicine. They're just kind of still doing green medicine. They're just coming with a diagnosis and they're just replacing the drug with a nutraceutical. It's not really going deep into the physiology and web. So over the years, you've met thousands of people that practice functional medicine. What are the main attributes you think make a good functional medicine practitioner?
Well, that's really a great question. I think the first and most important attribute, which you certainly exemplify, is a strong need to understand and to know, a driving force to go below the surface and to try to understand why, how, and what, the questions that lead you to a different understanding. And I have always been, and still are, extraordinarily impressed with the level of dedication that people who come into functional medicine to gain mastery of it bring into their life by discipline, because all of them have already gone through their degree program, they've been certified, they've opened their books, they've taken tests, they've taken certification exams. That was behind them in their lives. They didn't really even like some of those things they had to study to get through the exam. And now they come into functional medicine, and we are asking them, by the way, you got to reopen your biochemistry, you got to reopen your cell biology, you got to reopen your molecular genetics, you got to reopen your anatomy and physiology. It's like, who's going to do that? Well, I was told by good mentors back in 1990 when we started the Institute for Functional Medicine that you would never find people to do this. That this is just asking the impossible. People are too busy, their priorities, they don't want to do this, they didn't like those topics to begin with, they're not going to want to study it later. But for some reason, and this is why I'm still marveled at it, nearly 100,000 people have attended courses over the last 30 years and have spent time in opening up those books and learning those things and at different levels, probing. So I think the most singular important characteristic of a top-level functional medicine provider is the need to know and the willingness to do the self-sacrifice to say, I'm going to go back and I'm going to learn this stuff and I'm going to see how it applies to the life that I have as a professional and how I can help patients more successfully by implementing this conceptual framework. And by the way, I want to give a attribution to someone whose name would not be ever thought of, I believe, in the formation of the functional medicine model, but when we go back to those meetings in Victoria, I think was critically important because it goes to your concept, Atis, about Webb. And his name is Wayne Madsen. Wayne Madsen was a professor at MIT that I had met as a consequence of working as a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the Institute for the Achievement of Human Potential in Philadelphia that worked with brain injured children. And that work had brought me into all sorts of interesting, extraordinary moments of learning that I would have not had in the absence of being involved with Glenn Doman and his group in the Philadelphia Institute. One of the other members of that advisory board was Wayne Madsen from MIT. And Wayne Madsen was a systems biologist, and he was an informatics guru. He actually worked with Flint Beal in neurology, neurosciences at MIT and at Harvard Mass General in developing some of the earliest studies that really looked at oxidative injury and neuronal injury with neurodegenerative diseases. So Flint Beal, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he was really one of the pioneers in mechanistically understanding neuro-oxidative injury. And Wayne was the guy that actually kind of developed the algorithms and the thought process to bring together the web of neurochemistry. And so I was so impressed by Wayne, I said, would you come to this meeting, even though it's out of your, mainstream of your discipline, because I think we need your thinking about how to think in web-like kind of fashion. Now, this is fairly early. If you think back to 1989, we didn't have all the sophisticated algorithms and the artificial intelligence systems and the machine learning we have now, but this was the early stage of really developing an understanding of network pharmacology, network physiology. And so he really had a big impact on me and a big impact, I think, on the foundation of functional medicine. That is one of the themes that we've tried to demythologize a little bit in the curriculum of functional medicine to make it more accessible to people, because most clinicians do not go back and study informatics and become mavens of computer science. But if we can make these concepts accessible through other learning tools where they can start to think in network ways, in systems ways, without having to go to the software, I think we can transform thinking to start thinking upstream rather than downstream healthcare.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, just an observation I made that along the lines of what you're saying is, and you've had the same experience. I sometimes will spend a weekend teaching a seminar, and then I'd have two different types of questions come in. One was, I didn't understand this mechanism. I didn't understand what was going on. You can explain that. And that was one person. one group, and another group was just tell me what I need to do. And I was like, oh, like what's the protocol? I'm like, there isn't a protocol. It's an individualized approach. You got to work your way backward. And I can already tell like there's no connection here, and they just want to make it as simple as possible. But you have to have a lot of dedication to be a functional medicine practitioner. And one of the things I've also observed is it's such a difficult task that it takes a trigger. And one of the most common things I've seen as an educator over the years is when you go into stories of why someone got into functional medicine, the most common thing I hear is my wife got sick, my son got sick, my daughter got sick, my loved one got sick, I got sick. And it was that personal experience of going through, hey, I'm really ill and I can't find anything in the peer-reviewed literature to really support, an application here, or I already tried it all, but what do I do now? And that's where their intrigue in science coming from a medical background really got him into thinking that way, and then eventually going to functional medicine, then getting results and going, oh my goodness, this is a game changer for my life. I have to do this to other people. I have to go through and that's the common story that I've heard. What have you heard? What have you seen with what's the trigger that you see most people jump into functional medicine from? Is it the same thing, or have you noticed something different?
Yeah, I think initially it was exactly what you're saying. It was personal experience and some disillusionment and some frustration. Mark Hyman says a cute thing in his presentations. He says, I'm a resort doctor. I'm the doctor of last resort. And, that was kind of where it started, with people that were frustrated and didn't know where to turn because they weren't getting solutions from kind of a traditional disease diagnostic focus. But I think over the last few years it started to change. And the way it's changing is a consequence of what's going on in the healthcare system at large. Because it's now starting to be recognized that where some 80% of our healthcare expenditures are being placed, which is in the management of these chronic non-communicable diseases, that the solutions that we have through the traditional use of drugs and surgery are really not very effective. That if you really look at the outcome studies that are being published by major academic centers on the outcome of the use of those tools, you're seeing that they're really not being that effective in improving either quality of life or length of life, and therefore people are starting to say, well, maybe there's another answer. And so we're starting to see the whole concept of how you assess a dysfunction. Look at the ICD-9s now, go to ICD-10s, go to ICD-11s, in which we now see 5 times more diagnostic codes. Why is that? Because we recognize that these big codes that were used for disease placeholders weren't individualized enough, because we really didn't understand that under diabetes are like multiple forms of diabetes. Under heart disease, multiple forms with unique different physiological effects of how the genes and the environment are interacting in individual people. And so now personalization, moving away from kind of the disease of the average to the treatment of the individual, is really starting to become a major theme. And we're starting to see changes in reimbursement. Of course, COVID has done stuff with regard to telemedicine and ability to get information at a distance. The internet has opened up things that were previously closed down, that people didn't have access to this information. So all of this is, I think, pulling together to create a different view of what healthcare is going to look like over the years to come. And I think a lot of practitioners who come out of whatever their training was are starting to see, if I'm going to make my life fulfilled, both professionally and personally, I'm going to have to find a different mechanism than that of the old model, because the old model just isn't going to solve the problems that the future is holding.
Right. And you've been very influential in changing basic medicine and an approach to chronic disease. But you also started the largest nutraceutical company, professional nutraceutical company in the world, or played a huge part in making it what it was, which is Metagenics. And I remember the first time I saw medical food and UltraClear and like removing antigens and adding foods in, and that was such a breakthrough because no one had ever done that before. I don't think you get enough credit for some of the contributions you have made to nutraceutical development of functional medicine. You're always known as the father of functional, the concept, but tell us about your thought of really coming up with a Ultra Clear, right? It was the first
That was
one.
our first, yeah.
And then you were, no one's going to drink this powder. It tastes disgusting. Who's going to remove all these foods from their diet? But it was a huge part of really helping chronic patients calm down their inflammation and fix their gut and so forth. So, can you give us a little bit back? And I've always wanted to know, and since I got a chance to interview you, I want to ask you about it.
Well, that's a really interesting part of the story. Now, I thank you for your insight in bringing that up because I consider myself kind of an academic throughout all these years. I probably do it still today at some level. And when you start to then have a commercial product that you're associated with, you cross the river Styx, right? You start being seen in the eyes of many as compromising your academic impartiality, and you now have some kind of a liability that's attached to your persona as a consequence. And I think that's a legitimate concern, so I would not throw that out. But I also have come to recognize in the absence of being able to do something over what you have talked about as a problem, you've left a lot of people with unfulfilled expectations. So what I recognize is that if we were going to be involved in this field and really create a field, we needed to have the right kind of therapeutics that would match up with the constructs that we were talking about in the way of functional medicine and function. And because I had been studying the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and had been doing some work as a consultant with some of the nutrition product companies, I saw that there was this section 403J that was embedded in the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that was called Foods for Special Dietary Purposes. And it had not been exploited in our field. And when I started to read what the language was, it was put in there specifically as an amendment or as an update of the Act to allow for products that would deliver specific therapeutic nutrition under uniquely defined situations, like genetic metabolism diseases, like products that would be low in phenylalanine for children that have phenylketonuria. And when I started to think about that, I thought, well, hold on just a minute. That we're really talking about a specific food that's engineered to deliver characteristics to people with a specific physiological state of function to get outcome that we call a medical food. It's got certain claims that could be associated with it. And as I started to explore that, this would again be in the late 80s, I recognized that matched up somewhat with what we were trying to do in understanding the principles of function. So we had the functions of metabolic detoxification, gut restoration with the 4R program, mitochondrial resuscitation. These were concepts that we were coming up with in the late 80s, early 90s that all needed specific therapeutic tools to deliver. So that then led into ultimately the development of those medical foods, Ultra Inflammex, Ultra Clear Plus, Ultra Meal. I mean, that family of foods were specifically directed around those clinical conditions that we were associated with certain functional alterations. And so it was kind of a body of both logic in terms of assessment and then intervention that we were trying to use to create this field. And I think I'm fairly proud that did lift the bar. We had more and more companies getting involved with medical foods. We had more and more companies thinking therapeutically. And you know, the best reflection of an idea is when other people think enough of it that they start doing it too. So I think we did have an impact upon the whole industry of lifting the bar somewhat.
Oh, absolutely. I think you changed the whole field of nutraceuticals, and you really had nutraceutical companies now going, hey, we have to blend the science and put these things together, and formulations became really, really important, and mechanisms of products became really, really important. And I think every single major professional nutritional company now has a version of some of the things you did, initially came up with, because it was so effective and so obvious. And I'm not sure if it would have worked directly to consumers, because how many consumers are going to take something that maybe doesn't taste like candy and sweet and have to remove all the foods they like to eat. But going through a healthcare professional really, I think, made a difference. Now, I also remember when I was reading your, as a 20-year-old, reading your books you put together every year and trying to figure out what you were saying. And I had very strong influences with guy named Dr. George Goodhart and a guy named Dr. Wally Schmidt, which I know you know both of them, and so they've both passed since. But I would see them really incorporate, I guess, old school nutrition, or hey, you need some basic hydrochloric acid. You need to see, and people that are really sick need to have their gut healed. The basic principles of naturopathic medicine, and then I could see what you're writing about, and that you were converging the science to these mechanisms. And how much of an influence was that? So, as a professor, you're now interacting with people in the field of chiropractic nutrition, and you're meeting people like Dr. Bastyr and John Pizzarno. And what role do they play? Because you're around the best of the best. You're seeing real life clinical nutrition in a real world setting, not reading about it. How did that impact you?
Yeah, thank you. This is really insightful questions. I appreciate very much. So, George Goodhart, Wally Schmidt, Jerry Morantz, Sam Yanek, these were interesting and important figures in my education. I often say I'm not sure I ever came up with an original idea over the last 40-some years, but I think I was very good as a listener and as a consolidator of ideas into a system that could be applied across disciplines. I think my skill is synthesizing ideas. So I give a huge amount of credit to these leaders in these disciplines that I had the fortune to collaborate with and to learn from, and hopefully they learned some things from me. It was a cooperative learning experience. And that led, as you mentioned earlier, in 1978 was kind of a banner year, because that was the year Joe Pizzarno and I were both, it was another sabbatical year for me. I was teaching at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Joe was team teaching with me in a course called Is There a Healer in the House?, in which every week for 12 weeks in that course, we would bring in a healing discipline, some leader, and they would speak about what their discipline was to our students, and then the students were required to kind of consolidate that and come up with a unified concept about healing and health in the opportunities that were available. Out of that, then, talking with Bill Mitchell and Les Griffith, was born Bastyr University over a card table, and each of us putting $500 in the pot to try to start Bastyr. I then became the think back, it's almost humorous, the dean of the National Institutes of Naturopathic Medical Education, which was basically a business card. And Joe and I going to the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., trying to get us loans for students to study naturopathic medicine in this new institution, Bastyr, that was started in 1980. And so that whole period of time, we also were involved with the development of the curriculum of the National College of Naturopathic Medicine in Portland, and also the curriculum of the Canadian College of Naturopathic Medicine in Toronto. I was involved going back and forth to Toronto to set up the curriculum for that college as well. So this was a very robust period of really cross-disciplinary kind of fertilization. And you notice these are all kind of preceding events before ultimately bringing these people together for the formation of the Institute of Functional Medicine. So functional medicine really, I believe, was agnostic to discipline. What it was is focused on excellence, trying to get the best of the best to collaborate ideas together to create something that would unify the approaches across these different disciplines.
Right. Now, let's say we take a situation, we have a person who's got rheumatoid arthritis or some kind of chronic disease, and they go to 10 different functional medicine practitioners. It's expected they're going to have 10 different applications, 10 different models, and some would have some effect, some would have a greater effect. What do you think would be the key factor that determines some having a better effect than other models?
Well, that's a really great question. So I'm gonna cite something that happened to me yesterday, just to show you how this is an evolving model. So yesterday I had a really, really interesting hour-long discussion actually with Dr. Lisa Reiter. Lisa Reiter is the chair of the section of the National Institutes of Health on environmental relationships to autoimmune disease. Now, you hear what I just said? Environmental relationships to autoimmune disease. And she is the head of the section that has been studying now for 20 years. She has about something like 274 publications, so she's highly published. And we were talking about the nature of what we have learned, what she has learned, and what I think I've learned as well, probably not as detailed as she, being our expert in this field, of the environmental influences that modulate self to become non-self, so that people start producing antibodies that have bystander effects upon their own tissues that create what we call autoimmunity, when it's really not really autoimmunity. They're not allergic to themselves. They're allergic to things that happen to their body's materials that made them not self anymore. Oxidative phosphorylations, glycation, all these things that create then tissues that are no longer themselves, and the immune system is now recognizing that and producing antibodies to those foreigners, which then cross-reacts with your host tissue that we now call autoimmunity. And so she and I were talking about this concept, and it was as if we had a joint aha, because although we explained it differently based upon our backgrounds, we came to the same exact point in this conversation, that we both believe this is the nature of what is going on. So if there are many paths to a central theme, does it really matter how you got there? It's more important to get to the destination than it is to understand exactly how you got there. So the nice thing about the precepts or the fundamentals of functional medicine is that there are many ways of implementing approaches towards the management of those functional disturbances. But if you're focused on the right functional disturbances, you will get to the proof of the outcome, which is improving the patient's functional health. So I'm less concerned often about how you get there and more concerned about where you're trying to go. That's the functional medicine principle.
Right. Now, I want to share with you something that I've seen over the years as an educator. So just like you go to a seminar, you meet people introduce themselves, people give you their cards, and like sometimes you get a card, mold specialist, or you get someone, an endocrine specialist, or and they really focus on specializing in one thing. And then what I've learned over the years is like, okay, that's probably what they suffered through. So they ended up being like a mold specialist. Usually when you get to know them, they tell you the story of, hey, I really had this mold illness and I had to do these things. And they kind of that drove them to be an expert in that, right? That was their fuel. That was the trigger they needed to dedicate that time to them. So it was almost like when someone handed me a card of what they really like to specialize in, and they actually picked a specialty that told me like that's probably what they were dealing with. How do you remove that bias? What have you seen with that type of bias impacting the application of functional medicine when you're trying to do a web-like approach? Because I think that's one of the big hinders I see to people becoming more competent in their skill.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So I think there's two ways that we grow up intellectually in our professions. One way is to know more and more about less and less until we know everything about nothing. I'm saying that facetiously, but there are some times where you can so dig deep into specific micro focus that you are the world's expert about something that has very little relevancy to the big picture. The other way you can proceed is you can know more and more about less and less that ultimately tells you how this is interconnected to everything else. And I was very heavily influenced. I'm taking you now way back. I'm taking you back to 1970, my first faculty meeting as a junior professor at the University of Puget Sound, the first faculty meeting. And our speaker was, for the whole faculty at that meeting, was an English professor who was also an English philosophy professor and was very erudite. And he was speaking about the nature of scholarship. And it really hit me hard, because what he was saying is that if you were to look at those people that we consider to be intellectual leaders, in any global leaders, they're people that started off in a certain discipline. They had a certain name associated with their pedigree. So if you think of them at the base of some like trapezoid, like a pyramid. So they're at the base of the pyramid, and now they're going to become better at their profession. So they start climbing up the edge of that pyramid. And as they climb up the edge of the pyramid, they're finding, as they get to a certain elevation and they're learning, that they see people coming up on other edges of the pyramid that started up a base with a different discipline. And eventually, if they continue to pursue that, they become enlightened, because they become to the head of the pyramid where all disciplines interact one with the other. There's a universal understanding. That is true mastery. And that's the way I have always felt about my aspiration of my career. I'm never going to get, I know, to the head of the tip of the pyramid, but I'd like to think that I climbed out of the rainforest above the clouds, and I can kind of see these other disciplines and how they all interface around the central same principles. That to me is kind of the nature of professional development, and ultimately, hopefully, being better for other people, because you can understand their perspective and you can leverage that perspective in a more systematic way.
Right. That reminds me of this. I had a dinner with Dr. Joseph Pizzardo, your good friend, wonderful person. We actually got a chance to interview him. And he's like, hey, Tatis, if you had to rewrite naturopathic education, how would you do it? And I said, I would totally do it completely 100% different. And he goes, what would you start with? I go, I start with immunokines, cytokines, cell messengers, and then that would be the way where all the connections could be made. And I was really impacted by reading some of the stuff you put out, because remember, that's how I learned. I go, if you just understand the messenger systems first, instead of trying to look at gross anatomy of an organ like a liver or a brain tissue, all of a sudden there's no doubt that these things are all working together. But then you get people that specialize in these different variations, different fields, and then we have some misconnections and so forth. But where are we with labs? I mean, we don't really have efficient labs where we can measure a lot of these, and we don't really know what they are with them, and we're kind of still looking at just like some markers for the microbiome or some random SNPs. Where do you think labs need to evolve to?
Well, I think what's happening in the lab space is extraordinarily exciting, because there are two things that are kind of converging. One of which is biometrics that are 24/7 real-time things that come from wearables. I mean, we've never had, until the last 10 years, access to real-time 24/7 data like we're getting now from wearables, and the number of analytes, or the number of variables that we can start measuring with these wearables, is increasing all the time. I mean, things that were only relegated to a doctor's office previously, where you had to go and sit there and have a point of analysis done, and you're not sure if that was the same if you would have measured it an hour before or an hour later. Now we're getting trends and we're correlating them like continuous glucose monitoring. Look at how that has revolutionized our understanding of times in range and peaks and valleys and all the things that relate to why your hemoglobin A1C might be higher than you think it should be when your fasting blood sugar was fairly low, because your peaks are very high, and your peaks and valleys are what determine then the amount of glycosylation that's occurring of protein. So I think that what we're starting to witness with real-time data is that people are being introduced to their body in ways that we never had abilities to do before. That's number one. Number two is, I think, because of the nature of information management systems, we're now starting to be able to integrate all sorts of these omics technologies that have come way down in price by orders of magnitude, so that you can do the genomics and the epigenomics and the metabolomics and the microbiomics and the metagenomics. All these things start to become information systems that tie together to give a pattern. And there's your network. And now you're not just looking at something in isolation, you're looking at something in real time, cross organs, that is reflective of the body's function. And that to me is really the birthing, I think whatever we'll call it, maybe it won't be called functional medicine, maybe it'll just be called good medicine, is going to be around how function is measured and how the body is influenced by the experiences that people have in their lives, how they live, act, and believe, and how that influences their function.
Yeah, this is a really good point. And with your Lifestyle Medicine Institute, you cover a lot of this, right? Because I was privileged to attend a meeting, I think a couple of years ago, or before COVID, and it was a really deep dive into this. And I definitely think it has a place in the future. We're still learning, and the technology keeps getting better all the time. Now, when it comes to education and application, here's an argument I hear all the time. They said, hear from people, you functional medicine people, you just like to geek out on biochemistry, you like to geek out on labs. Ultimately, does any of that really matter? If they sleep well, they have good relationships, if they eat well, wouldn't that fix most things? Why do we need this complicated dive into all these things? And there's a good point. I mean, we hear that and we go, yeah, there's some truth to that. There's also some things that that need to go deeper. But what is your comment with that statement?
Well, I think that is generally correct. If we can get people to do some of these big things, they're going to peel off a lot of things that are creating dysfunction, and they will achieve higher levels of health and vitality, no question about it. However, we've started to recognize the heterogeneity of how people respond to the same thing within this complex gene pool that we live with is much greater than we previously expected. I think that it was felt that the variation in response to our genes responding to the environment was fairly narrow. That's kind of like how the RDAs were set, with a certain narrow tolerance for what was considered adequate nutrition in the forms of vitamins and minerals. Now we recognize that the range of functional characteristics of these variables can be much broader than we expected. And people say, well, what's the best diet? And I say, well, for who? Because there is no such thing as a perfect diet for everyone. There are people that from your experience are sensitive to virtually any different number of things that other people are not sensitive to. So I think that we first land on the beachhead of here are some general principles. Get sugar out of your diet, get processed foods out of your diet, get daily exercise, increase the fiber in your diet, and get more plant-based foods, try to stay organic. I mean, there are certain principles that we land on, but then the next level is the more precision kind of intervention that can, for people that are still burdened with problems, and that's where the practitioner comes to play, because a practitioner is the assessment expert that provides a next level of understanding.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's a really good way to answer that. There's a comment Christy Hughes made when I was interviewing her, and we were talking about applications of different types of practitioner types in functional medicine, and she labeled it to two types. One was very good at dissecting everything and jumping into everything and figuring things out, to the minute detail and that deep dive. But they tend to lack the ability to connect with the patient and communicate the information. This is just what she observed, and I agree. I observed that too, and I can see myself leaning toward one side versus the other. And those that don't go as much of a deep dive into the depth of all the things you can evaluate in a functional medicine approach, but they have really good ability to engage and discuss with their patients, and they seem to be better in that side of it. Have you seen that same classification? That I'm making it into a binary, list here, but have you seen that, or what have you noticed with that? What skills?
Yeah, I think you're totally on target. To me, when we talk about function, in the broadest sense of the term, function breaks down into 4 subcategories. And we could probably debate whether these are the right categories, but they're the ones that I have kind of feel that they bucket into. So those 4 functional areas are physical function, metabolic function, cognitive function, and then the last one that we often forget that I think is as important or more than the other 3 is behavioral function. And so you start to see social determinants of disease. That's a term that's kind of coming up more and more now in the literature. What is social determinants of disease? That's a behavioral environment that's sending signals into your genes to pick up those signals and create then an outcome called your function. So some practitioners are extraordinarily adept at being able to tap into that 4th function, behavioral function, and get the person to understand themselves in a different way, get themselves to be willing to make changes, because we know that the best of advice, if not implemented and complied with or adhered to, doesn't produce much benefit. So there are certain gifted practitioners who are really experts in the behavioral functional aspects, which is a creative and important part of the full matrix of functions. So if you were to say to me, would it be better to do more lab tests or to be better at being a cognitive listener, and to be a good relationship builder, and to be a good coach, I would have to say probably the latter is even more important than the former.
I agree.
But they work together. They're not totally independent.
Right, and I think for myself, I tend to really not be as good with those deep personal connections with other people. So, like if I fail with a case that I'm working on and give it everything I have, and it's not making my change, then the natural tendency would be is let me send it to another critical biochemical depth functional medicine, clinician and see what they come up with. And that's what I've learned over the years. Like, I'm better off sending them to the other side where they can have deep connections. And I had Monique Class on, as you know, she's brilliant at that. She has such a gift for that, such skill for that. And I think another thing, just for people that are trying to improve their skills as a functional medicine practitioner, is how important that side of it is. And maybe you do have a tendency to one side, but it's good to develop the skills of the other side of it. So if you're a really great communicator and don't take deep dives into nutrition and biochemistry, maybe that's where you need to focus on a little bit more. And then also, if all you're doing is taking a deep dive and coming up with a diagnosis and having someone expect to understand that would be the approach. Now, I know you're busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time for this interview, Dr. Bland. But I do have a question we always end with all interviewers, and the question is, and we have as you know, it takes a lot of dedication to take on the challenge of learning and implementing functional medicine into a clinical model. And we really have a group of people that are very new to functional medicine. They see the impact of it. Something changed their life about it. Maybe they had their own personal experience with it. Maybe they heard someone speak and that the lights went on, but they're new and they're going through the process. And it's really a daunting process. So the first part of the question is, what advice would you give them? And then we have another group of people that have been doing functional medicine for 10, 20 years, maybe even since the beginning. And they're just looking for one single nugget. You know, they're the personality that will spend 20 hours listening to a seminar just to get one new thing that they can do. They don't need to have, lots of information, just looking for that little piece of information that makes a difference. That's a second group. And what kind of advice would you give them?
Yeah, so I that's a really that's a challenging question, because there are lots of places that I could go, but I'll try to be concise. I think for the new person coming in, where do they start? I go back to what I learned, over 40 years ago about the importance of the gut. We were the first group to really start talking about gastrointestinal restoration. We developed that 4R program, the remove, replace, reinoculate, repair concept. And if a person starts down that path with the gut function, now that the microbiome has become so, on the marquee, the effects that they have on their patients just by becoming skilled in that one aspect can be enormous, and it gives confidence and ability to show the value of what we're doing. So that's where I suggest all people kind of start, because it's an entree point into understanding much broader issues related to what goes through the portal system to the cytochrome P450 detox system in the liver, and then how that interfaces with mitochondrial function and bioenergetics. But you start with the gut, and then you go out from there. I think is a very good place to start. You can already start seeing yourself as a star just by getting skilled in how to manage gastrointestinal restoration. For those that are much more sophisticated and downstream learners in the functional medicine model, I think the big aha, and it is the full object of my attention right now with what we're doing, both in the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute and also this new little company I put together called Big Bold Health, is focusing on nutraepigenomics. I think nutraepigenomics, that you can put on and take off these marks that mark how the genes and how they regulate gene expression patterns and change the phenotype, is a huge, huge breakthrough. It is something that we have talked about for years, but we didn't have the basic science to understand how to actually manipulate with intervention these epigenetic marks that are put onto specific cell types. And for me, we're focusing on the immune cell types. But now we're starting to see significant new therapeutic tools that actually allow us to regulate the epigenome with intervention. To me, that is that's the holy grail. That's the place where we can really start changing people that are locked into post-traumatic physiological stress systems with inflammaging and feed-forward cycles of dysfunction. So for the skilled clinician, our fall, actually it's October 5th and 6th, we're going back to have a live PLMI meeting. It'll be in Seattle. And it's really focused on nutritional epigenomics. What is this revolution? How do you enhance your practice by implementing this? I've got some world leaders who are going to be speaking, including Patrice Khani, who I think is probably the most significant singular person in the evolution of our understanding of the gut microbiome in the world. He's a remarkable investigator, clinician. And so that's the focus of where I think our the tip of the spear is pointed right now.
Fantastic. Well, I just wanted to thank you, not just for the interview, but for being such an influence on my life. And you know, your work has really impacted thousands of people like me. And we're out there impacting other people. And then patients we're impacting are impacting other people. So thank you for everything. And it was such a pleasure to have you with us.
I feel the same way about you, and keep up the great work. It's all a team. We're really going to change the way healthcare is practiced through this collaborative effort. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Take care.
Have a great
Bye-bye.